She paid $8 for a dead orchard, and everyone in Caldwell Crossing watched her do it. Not everyone literally, not all at once, but the way news moved through a settlement of 200 people in the autumn of 1883, it amounted to the same thing. By sundown on the day, Mabel Forsythe counted out 8 crumpled dollars onto Jonas Peck's counter and signed her name to a bill of sale for 43 apple trees that hadn't produced fruit in 3 seasons. Every household within a half-day's ride knew about it. And the verdict, delivered through the particular shorthand of frontier women who had seen too many desperate choices made by people with too little left, was the same everywhere it landed. $8 for dead trees. Poor woman. She must be further gone than anyone realized. Mabel was 31 years old, recently widowed, and in possession of $6.40 after the transaction, which was everything she had that wasn't already owed to someone. She had a daughter, 7 years old, named Pearl. She had a farmhouse that belonged to her outright because her husband Cole had paid it off the year before he died, which was the only piece of good luck she could point to in the 12 months since the fever took him. She had a kitchen garden that produced adequately, a cow named for no reason she could now remember, and 43 apple trees on the eastern slope of her property that had not done what apple trees were supposed to do since the summer Cole got sick. What she did not have was any plan that made sense to anyone who heard it, including, some mornings, herself. But here is what the women of Caldwell Crossing did not understand, standing in their kitchens, passing the news back and forth over the distances between their claims. Mabel Forsythe had not bought dead trees. She had bought a problem that 43 separate previous owners had decided was unsolvable, and she had paid $8 for the right to prove every single one of them wrong. The trees had belonged to Jonas Peck as part of a land purchase he'd made 4 years prior. He was a practical man with no patience for problems that didn't answer quickly, and when the orchard failed to produce in its second season under his ownership, he'd written it off and focused his attention elsewhere. Before him, the previous occupant of that claim had tried 2 different remedies, neither of which he could adequately explain when asked, and had eventually concluded that the soil in that particular slope was spent. The slope was 100 yards from Mabel's eastern fence line. She had looked at those trees from her kitchen window every morning for 3 years. Cole had said, more than once, that the orchard was simply finished. That land wore out and those trees were worn out, and there was nothing to be done. She had not argued with him because Cole was usually right about practical things, and because arguing about someone else's trees while your own fences needed mending was a luxury you couldn't afford on a working homestead. But she had kept looking at them, every morning with her first cup of coffee, standing at the kitchen window before Pearl woke up, and the day's demands assembled themselves into the queue they always formed. She had looked at those trees and noticed things she hadn't been able to stop noticing. The way the leaf drop was uneven, earlier on the northern end of the row than the southern. The way 2 trees in the middle of the grove had a different color to their bark than the ones flanking them. The way the ground around the base of the trees held water differently depending on where you stood. She had not known what any of it meant. She had just known that it meant something, and that nobody had bothered to find out what. When Jonas Peck put up a notice that he was willing to sell the orchard parcel separately from the rest of his land, Mabel had folded the notice into her apron pocket, walked home, and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours while Pearl slept. She had gone through everything she knew, everything she had watched and noted and wondered about for 3 years, and she had arrived at something that was not quite a plan, but was the shape of one. She went back to Peck the next morning with $8. He looked at the money and then at her with an expression she had seen before. The particular careful sympathy of a man who thinks he is taking advantage of someone and has almost convinced himself he isn't. "Mrs. Forsythe," he said, "those trees are done. I've had 2 men look at them." "I know," she said. "That's why the price is $8. He took the money. The walk home from Peck's store was a 1/4 mile. She carried the bill of sale folded in her coat pocket and walked it without stopping, because stopping would have given her room to reconsider, and she had already decided that reconsidering was a thing she was not going to do. Pearl was at the neighbors for the morning. The house was quiet. Mabel put the bill of sale on the kitchen table and put her hands flat on either side of it and looked at it for a long minute. Then she picked up her notebook, the one she'd been keeping since Cole died, and she started writing down everything she had ever noticed about those trees. She filled 4 pages before she stopped, not because she'd run out of things to write, but because her hand was cramping and the morning was getting away from her. She looked at the 4 pages. There was more there than she'd realized she'd been holding. More observations, more questions, more specific details that she hadn't known she was storing until she tried to put them in order. She closed the notebook and went to the barn to get the tools she'd need. The first morning she spent in the orchard, she didn't touch a single tree. She walked the rows slowly from one end to the other and back again, looking at everything she had been looking at through the window and looking at it up close for the first time. She crouched beside root systems. She pressed her palm against bark. She scraped very thin slivers of it back with her thumbnail, where it looked wrong, and examined what was underneath. She turned over soil near the bases of the worst-looking trees and looked at the color and the texture and the way it broke apart or didn't. She wrote all of it down. Lorena Dodd came by on the second day. She was Mabel's nearest neighbor, 50 yards to the north, a woman of about 45, who had been on the frontier longer than almost anyone else in the settlement, and who communicated primarily through observation and short declarative sentences. She appeared at the edge of the orchard with no announcement, which was her way. "I heard you bought the peck trees," she said. "Did," Mabel said. She was crouched beside the root system of a tree near the middle of the second row, making notes. Lorena looked at the trees around them. She was a woman whose face rarely moved much when she was forming opinions, but her eyes moved constantly, taking everything in. "What are you finding?" Mabel looked up. The question surprised her slightly. She had expected commentary, not inquiry. "Some things," she said. "I'm still in the looking stage." "What kind of things?" Mabel stood and showed her the notebook. Lorena read it without speaking for longer than most people would have, which meant she was actually reading it and not performing the act of reading it. "The soil variation," she said. "You think that's the issue, part of it. The drainage is wrong on the north end. You can feel it in the ground even now. And these 2 trees here," Mabel pointed at the pair in the middle row, whose bark had caught her attention. "Something happened to them at the root level. They don't look like the others. All of them failing, though." "Yes," Mabel said, "but not all for the same reason. The north end is drowning, the south end is something else. And those 2 in the middle are a third thing entirely." Lorena looked at her steadily. "That's either a very smart observation or a very complicated way to fail." "I know," Mabel said. "I'm hoping it's the first one." Lorena handed the notebook back. "Let me know what you find." She left the same way she'd arrived, without ceremony, stepping back through the fence line and across to her own property. Mabel wrote down the conversation at the bottom of the page. Not because it was important in itself, but because the habit of writing things down was becoming something she relied on, in a way she hadn't anticipated when she'd started. The settlement learned about the notebook on the 3rd week. It was not Lorena who mentioned it. Lorena was not the kind of woman who mentioned things. It was Pearl, who was 7 and had no particular opinion about what was private and what wasn't, who told Vera Osgood's daughter at school that her mama was out in the orchard every morning writing a book about trees. Vera Osgood's daughter told her mother. Vera Osgood was the kind of woman who kept careful track of what everyone in Caldwell Crossing was doing and circulated the information in the way of someone performing a public service. By the following Sunday, Mabel was aware that people were talking. She found out the specific shape of the talk when she went into Hartwell's dry goods for salt and twine, and Delphine Hartwell, who ran the store while her husband worked the eastern fields, gave her the particular greeting of a woman who has been discussing you with someone in the past hour and is not certain whether you know it. "Mabel," she said, "I heard you've been out in that orchard every day." "Most days," Mabel said. "Writing in a notebook." "Yes." Delphine straightened something on the counter that didn't need straightening. "People are wondering what you're doing out there exactly. Figuring out what's wrong with the trees. They think the trees are past figuring. I know they do." Mabel counted out the change for the salt. "I'm not sure they're right." Delphine looked at her with an expression that was more kindness than skepticism, which was something Mabel noted and appreciated. "What does Pearl think about all this time in the orchard?" "Pearl thinks it's interesting," Mabel said. "She comes with me on Saturdays. She's been identifying which trees she plans to climb when they're healthy. Something moved across Delphine's face at that. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. She's a confident child. She is, Mabel agreed. She picked up her salt and her twine and said good morning, and went out into the October air, which had the particular bite to it that meant the season was changing faster than anyone was ready for. She walked home thinking about drainage. The north end of the orchard was the problem she'd been circling for 2 weeks without finding the center of. The soil there held water in a way that should have been obvious to whoever planted the trees, but apparently hadn't been, or had been noticed and accepted as unchangeable. In either case, nothing had been done about it, and the roots of the 6 trees on the north end were spending their lives in conditions that were slowly suffocating them from the ground up. The fix, when she finally saw it clearly enough to write it down in the notebook as a plan rather than a question, was not simple. It required redirecting the natural drainage path on that side of the slope, which required digging, which required time and labor she was doing alone. She started on a Wednesday and finished the drainage work 2 weeks later, with help she had not expected and had not asked for. Lorena Dodd showed up on the 4th morning of the digging with a second shovel and said nothing about it, only asked which end of the trench she wanted help with. Mabel pointed and Lorena dug, and by the end of that morning, they had done twice what Mabel could have managed alone. "You don't have to do this," Mabel said when they stopped at midday. "I know I don't," Lorena said. That was the end of the discussion. On the last day of the drainage work, Pearl came out after school and helped carry the smaller loads of displaced soil to the place Mabel had marked as the new grade. She was small for 7, but she worked with a focused diligence that reminded Mabel so strongly of coal that she had to look away for a moment. "Will it work?" Pearl asked. "I think so," Mabel said. "The water needs somewhere to go that isn't through the roots. Now it has somewhere." Pearl looked at the nearest tree with the evaluating expression she brought to most things. "When will we know?" "Spring," Mabel said. "Maybe late spring." Pearl considered this with the patience of a child who has already learned that some things cannot be hurried. "All right," she said, and picked up her load of soil. The notebook grew through October and November. Mabel filled the first one before Thanksgiving and started a second, which was when she understood that what she was building was not a record of guesswork, but something more structured, a map of cause and effect, trail of adjustments and observations, each one building on the last. She had separated her approaches by section. The north end needed the drainage work, plus a specific soil amendment she'd read about in an agricultural pamphlet that Lorena had given her, having ordered it from a publisher in Cincinnati. The south end was a different problem, something with the canopy structure that had been allowed to develop wrong over years without correction. Those trees weren't dying for lack of water or for soil reasons. They were dying because they couldn't breathe, because decades of untended growth had created a density that blocked what light reached the slope. The pruning was careful, slower work than the drainage. She had never pruned a neglected orchard before. She had pruned the small apple trees Cole had planted near the house, but those were young trees that had never been mishandled, and pruning them was straightforward. These trees had grown wrong for so long that wrong had become their shape, and she had to think about each cut the way you thought about a thing you couldn't undo. She wrote about each tree, specifically in the notebook, which branches came off and why, what she expected to happen afterward, what actually happened, which was sometimes what she expected and sometimes not, and both outcomes went into the notebook because both were information. The 2 trees in the middle of the second row remained the ones that concerned her most. She had not touched them yet. She had been watching them for 6 weeks and had formed a theory she wasn't certain of, and she did not want to do anything to those trees until she was more certain. Her theory was that they had been grafted onto rootstock that was incompatible with the local soil conditions. The graft unions, the places where the productive wood had been joined to the root base, were showing a kind of slow separation that she had seen described in the pamphlet and had never expected to see in person. The wood above the union was struggling to pull from roots that were no longer fully connected to it. She wrote down the theory in November with the specific note, "Not confirmed. Observe until spring." Vera Osgood came by on a Saturday in early December. She arrived the way she arrived everywhere, announced by the sound of her horse and the particular energy of a woman who considers her presence a gift. She found Mabel in the orchard, which was by then not a surprise to anyone who knew her schedule. "Mabel," she said from the fence line, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Just looking," Mabel said. Vera stepped over the fence with the deliberate care of a woman in good shoes. She looked at the trees around her with the expression of someone who had a prepared opinion and was deciding how to deliver it. "I heard you've been working out here every day since October. Yes, in the cold. The trees don't know it's cold." Vera looked at her. "I don't mean to pry. I'm asking because I'm genuinely." She paused, selecting her word, curious. "Everyone assumed these trees were finished, and you just stepped in and started treating them like they weren't." "They weren't finished," Mabel said. "They were sick. Those are different things. How do you know the difference?" Mabel considered this honestly. "You look at them carefully enough, and you write down what you see so you don't confuse what's actually there with what you expect to be there." Vera was quiet for a moment. She had a look on her face that Mabel couldn't entirely read. "My husband's kitchen garden produced half of what it should have this year," she said. "He thinks it's just the season." "Maybe it is," Mabel said. "What else changed?" Vera looked at her. "What?" "From the year before. What else changed? Where he watered, what he planted near what, whether anything was put in the soil before planting." Vera's expression shifted into something more uncertain, less composed. I don't know. I'd have to ask him." "Ask him," Mabel said, "and write down the answers. Even if nothing comes of it, the writing makes the question more specific." Vera stood in the orchard for another minute, looking at the trees with a different quality of attention than she'd arrived with. Then she said, "You know people have been saying things. I know. I was one of them." She said it plainly, without apology, but without deflection either. "I thought you were making a mistake. I still think $8 was a lot for what everyone decided was done," Mabel said. "Yes, I know what it looked like. It looked like grief talking," Vera said, "like someone who'd lost their footing and was reaching for something to hold on to." The word grief landed in the space between them and sat there. "Maybe it was that too," Mabel said finally. "Cole used to look at those trees and say they were finished. I couldn't stop wondering if he was wrong." Vera was quiet. Then she said, "Well, in the way people say it when they're acknowledging something without knowing what else to do with it." She stepped back over the fence. "Tell me when there's something to see." Mabel told her she would. She stood in the orchard a few minutes after Vera left and then went back to the notebook and wrote down the conversation. Not every word of it, just the shape of it. The part about grief she underlined once, and then crossed out the underline, because it was true, but it was not the only true thing, and she didn't want to mistake it for the whole answer. December was the hardest month, not because the work stopped, the work didn't stop, but because the results hadn't started yet, and the distance between those two things had a particular weight in the shortest, coldest weeks of the year. She went to the orchard every morning and looked at the trees and wrote down what she saw, which was mostly the same as what she had seen the day before, because trees in winter do not move quickly toward anything. Pearl asked, one evening, whether Mama was sure this was going to work. "No," Mabel said. "I'm not sure. I think it's going to work." Pearl considered the distinction with the seriousness she applied to most things. "What's the difference? Sure means you know before you've seen it. Think means you've seen enough to believe it's likely." Mabel looked at her. "I've seen enough." Pearl nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, and went back to her arithmetic. Mabel sat at the table after Pearl was asleep and opened the notebook to a page she'd written in October and read it through. She was right about some of it. She had already been wrong about two things, and she had corrected them in the notebook with the dates so she could see where her thinking had changed. The wrongness didn't worry her exactly. The wrongness was information. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, "December. Waiting is the work now. Trees are doing what trees do. North drainage holding. No pooling in the bad rain last week. South canopy, open enough to see the sky through properly for the first time probably in 15 years. The two center trees. Watching. Not ready to touch them until I understand what I'm seeing." She closed the notebook and let the fire die down and went to bed. Lorena Dodd came for the two center trees. She showed up in January with information that Mabel had not been able to find anywhere in the settlement, which was that her late husband had grafted trees using an eastern rootstock that he had ordered from a nursery in Pennsylvania for 3 seasons in the mid-70s. Lorena had found an old receipt in a box she'd been going through. The nursery name was on it, and the rootstock variety, and the years. She handed Mabel the receipt without preamble. Mabel looked at it. She looked at Lorena. "This is what's wrong with the center trees." "I believe so," Lorena said. "That rootstock doesn't like this ground. Too much clay content when the seasons are wet. I don't know why nobody figured this out at the time." "Because nobody was writing it down," Mabel said. Lorena made a sound that might have been agreement. "What do you do with trees that are grafted wrong?" "Regraft them," Mabel said. "Cut back to below the union and regraft onto proper rootstock. It's a 2-year recovery at minimum. You know how to do that?" "I know the theory of it," Mabel said carefully. "I haven't done it. I've been reading about it." "Whose rootstock?" "Henderson Brothers out of Springfield. I've written to them twice. They have a variety that's been successful in this soil type." Lorena looked at her steadily. "When does this arrive?" "Spring," Mabel said, "if the second letter gets an answer." The second letter got an answer in February. The rootstock would arrive in March. Mabel wrote the date in the notebook and underlined it once, which was more ceremony than she usually allowed herself in the notes. The trouble arrived the week after, the way trouble arrives in small places, through the person you were least prepared for. Edgar Briggs was Caldwell Crossing's nearest approximation of an agricultural authority. He had 200 acres under cultivation east of the settlement, a subscription to 3 farming publications, and a habit of holding forth on soil science at any gathering that lasted long enough for the conversation to arrive there. He had been farming the region for 20 years. He was 61 years old and not inclined to update his opinions without compelling evidence, which in practice meant he rarely updated them at all. He came to the orchard on a morning in February without Mabel knowing he was coming, which she only discovered when she came around the end of the second row and found him standing in the middle of it with his hands in his coat pockets. "Mr. Briggs," she said. "Mrs. Forsythe." He had an expression she had seen before in different faces, a careful version of condescension that presented itself as concern. "I heard about the work you've been doing out here." "Then you've heard about the same thing everyone else has," she said. "I thought I'd have a look." She let him look. She watched him while he looked, which was its own kind of information. He walked the north end of the orchard without appearing to notice the drainage work, which told her he was not actually examining the ground. He looked at the pruned canopy on the south end with an expression that didn't change. He stopped at the 2 center trees and stood there longer, which she noted. "You've done significant pruning," he said finally. "On the south end, yes. That's aggressive for trees in this condition." "The condition was caused partly by the canopy structure," Mabel said. "The pruning addresses the cause, not the symptom." Briggs looked at her. "Who told you that?" "I worked it out," she said, "from what I was seeing and from reading." "Reading what?" She told him the pamphlet title. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who has read something and dismissed it, and is now confronting the evidence that someone else took it seriously. "Those 2," he said, nodding at the center trees. "What's your plan?" She told him about the rootstock, the regrafting, the letter to Springfield. He listened with his hands still in his coat pockets and his face doing the particular thing it did when information was arriving that he hadn't been prepared to receive. "That's a significant undertaking," he said when she finished. "For trees that may not respond." "They'll respond," Mabel said. "The wood above the union is still viable. The problem is the connection, not the tree. You're confident in that assessment." "I'm confident in what the evidence shows," she said. "The assessment follows from it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize, something between skepticism and a reluctant acknowledgement that he had come here expecting to find something that wasn't what he was finding. "If you're right," he said carefully, "about the rootstock, if the regrafting takes and those trees come back, that would be." He stopped. "A thing nobody expected," Mabel said. "Yes," he said. "That." He left without saying anything further that was useful. But she wrote the conversation down, because the way he'd stopped at those 2 trees told her she was looking at the right problem. A man who had 20 years of experience and didn't expect to learn anything from a widow's notebook had still stopped and looked longer at the trees she was most uncertain about. That meant something. The rootstock from Springfield arrived on a Thursday in late March, packed in damp burlap and wooden crating, and it was better than she'd expected. The nursery had included 2 extra grafts beyond her order, with a note in a neat hand that said they'd heard from a contact in Caldwell Crossing about the work she was doing and wanted to give her the best chance of success. She thought about who the contact might be. She decided it was probably Lorena. She did the regrafting over 2 days, working slowly and with more attention than she had ever given to anything in her life. Pearl sat on an overturned crate nearby both days, watching without talking, which was the right kind of company for work that required full concentration. On the second afternoon, when the graft unions were wrapped and set, Pearl asked, "Will they know something happened to them?" Mabel looked at the trees. "I think they'll respond to it," she said. "Whether they know in the way you mean, I couldn't say." Pearl looked at the wrapped graft points. "I hope they're all right. I think they will be." That evening, Mabel wrote 4 pages in the notebook. The specific details of each graft, the moisture conditions, the weather during the procedure, the condition of the material from Springfield. She wrote what she expected to see and when. She noted the variables she couldn't control. Spring came the way it came to that part of the country, indifferently and in pieces. There was a frost in April that had Mabel out in the orchard at 5 in the morning, covering the most vulnerable new growth with cloth, moving between the rows by lamplight while Pearl slept. There was a week of too dry weather in early May that required hand watering at the base of the trees she was most concerned about. The north end was the first to show signs. It came as leaf emergence that was different in character from what she had seen from those trees in the years of watching them through the window. Denser, more uniform, the kind of growth that indicated root systems operating without interference for the first time in years. Mabel stood at the end of the north row on a morning in late April and looked at those leaves and felt something that she didn't try to name because naming it would have been premature. She wrote in the notebook, "North End. First strong emergence. Drainage holding. This is what addressed drainage looks like." The south end was slower, which she had expected. The pruning had been aggressive, and the trees needed time to understand what they'd been given, which was light and space and air. By mid-May, the new growth on the south end was unmistakable. The shape of the canopy was different, open where it had been closed. Something about it made the whole southern row look like a different planting. The 2 center trees were the ones that kept her awake. By the end of May, they had shown nothing. No emergence at the graft sites, no new growth, no signal in either direction. She checked them every morning with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and went to the notebook and wrote down the same entry, watching. No change. Lorena came by one evening in the first week of June and stood with her at the fence line looking at those 2 trees in the late light. "They're taking their time," Lorena said. "Yes, is that bad?" "It can go either way," Mabel said. "Late response can mean a slow take, which eventually produces, or it can mean the graft didn't hold." She was quiet for a moment. "I won't know for another few weeks." Lorena looked at the trees. She had, Mabel had come to understand, a quality of attention that was unusual in its patience. She didn't look at things the way most people looked at things, with a conclusion forming before the looking was finished. She simply looked. "You did it right," Lorena said finally. "I tried to. I've watched you out here since October," Lorena said. "You did it right." It was not the same as knowing the trees would respond, but it was said by someone who didn't say things she didn't mean, and it settled something in Mabel that had been unsettled for weeks. The change in the center trees came on a Wednesday in the second week of June. Mabel saw it before she was close enough to be certain, from 20 feet away, the quality of the morning light, catching something at the graft sites on both trees that hadn't been there the evening before. She walked the distance without hurrying, because hurrying would have been a performance for an audience that wasn't there. And when she reached the trees and looked closely at what she was seeing, she stood there for a full minute without writing anything. New growth. Both trees. Above the graft sites, precisely where she had hoped to see it. She wrote in the notebook, June 11, center trees responding, both, union holding. This is what a correct graft looks like in this soil type. She went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the orchard the way she had looked at it for 3 years through this window. And the thing she had been looking at and wondering about was different now. It was the same trees and the same slope and the same eastern light, but the shape of it had changed, and she had been the reason it changed. And that was not a small thing to stand at a window and know. Pearl came downstairs at 7:30 and found her there. "Mama," "The center trees," Mabel said. "Come look." Pearl came and looked through the window. "They look different," she said. "They responded," Mabel said. Pearl studied the orchard for a moment with her 7-year-old certainty. "I knew they would," she said, and went to find her breakfast. The summer moved with the speed that summers have when the work inside them is real. The orchard required a different kind of attention now, not the attention of someone trying to understand what was wrong, but the attention of someone managing what was going right, which was a different and more pleasant kind of labor. She documented everything: the rate of new growth, the condition of the emerging branch structure, the soil moisture levels she was maintaining, the specific input she was using, and in what proportions. The notebook that had begun as a record of observation had become a record of method, and the method was working in a way that exceeded what she had originally projected. The trees were not going to produce fruit this season. She had never expected them to. What they were doing was more important than producing fruit. They were building the internal structure, the root depth, the branch framework, the cellular density that made fruit production possible and sustainable for decades, rather than for a season or two before declining again. She explained this to Lorena in July. Lorena listened and then said, "So next year." "For most of them," Mabel said. "The center trees, maybe the year after. Regrafted trees take longer to come fully into production." Lorena nodded. "And you know all this because you wrote it down." "I know it because I watched, and then wrote it down, yes." Lorena was quiet. She looked at the orchard, which in summer looked like a different place than it had in October. Full of leaf, full of the particular movement that healthy trees in a good wind have. "You know there are other people around here with failing orchards," she said. "I know. Old Sampson, on the creek road. His peach trees have been declining for 2 years. He's been told the same thing you were told. That they're done. Are they done?" "I don't know," Lorena said. "But I suspect they're not." Mabel looked at the orchard. She thought about the notebook, the method she had built from the ground up through 8 months of observation and adjustment and documentation. She thought about what she had told Vera Osgood in December about writing things down. "Ask Sampson if he'd like a conversation," she said. Lorena made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but belonged in the same neighborhood. "I thought you'd say that." The conversation with Caleb Sampson happened on a Thursday afternoon in late July. He was a man in his mid-50s, deliberate and a little formal in the way of someone who had learned to be careful about what he admitted to. He had heard about the orchard work, which was not surprising since everyone in Caldwell Crossing had heard about the orchard work. He had not come to her, which told her something about the relationship between what he needed and what he was willing to ask for. She went to his peach trees first before they talked. She walked them the way she had walked her own orchard in October, slowly, looking at everything. She wrote in her notebook while he watched. He did not ask what she was writing. After 40 minutes, she stopped and looked at her notes. 3 separate issues, she said. 2 of them addressable this season. One of them. She pointed at a cluster of trees on the western edge. Those have a canopy problem, similar to what I found on my southern section. The pruning is going to look severe. It's going to look like I'm making it worse. He looked at those trees. But you'd be making it better. I believe so. He was quiet. Then how sure are you? Sure enough to tell you about it, she said. Not so sure I'd bet your trees without your permission. He almost smiled at that. What do you need from me? Your records, if you have any. What you've done, what you've noticed, any changes in the past 2 seasons. She paused. And your patience. This takes longer than people want it to take. Caleb Sampson nodded slowly, the nod of a man agreeing to something he'd been reluctant to agree to and had decided to stop being reluctant about. Come back Saturday, he said. I'll have what recs I have. She went back Saturday. She went back the Saturday after that. She was at Sampson's orchard 4 times in August, and by September she had documented his situation as thoroughly as she had documented her own. She left him with written notes each time, specific instructions for what to do between her visits and why, framed not as directions from someone who knew better, but as the logical extension of what the observation showed. Edgar Briggs heard about the Sampson work-through, Mabel suspected, the same network that had distributed every other piece of information about her since October. He came back to her orchard in September. She was there when he arrived, which was usual. He stopped at the fence line and looked at the trees for a long time before he said anything. The orchard in September was not producing fruit, which she had told him clearly would be the case. But it looked the way a healthy orchard looked, which was different from how it had looked when he'd visited in February. "I was wrong," he said, from the fence line. He didn't offer any further explanation or context for this statement. He simply made it, the way a man makes a statement he has been working up to and has decided to stop postponing. Mabel looked at him. "About what specifically?" "About whether this was worth doing," he said, "and about whether you knew what you were doing." "I didn't know entirely," she said. "I had good reasons to think it was worth trying." "There's a difference between those things," he said. "Yes," she said, "there is." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the orchard again. "I have a stand of walnut trees on my north property that have been in decline for 4 years. I've been told they're done." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like this easily, she understood. He was a man who believed in the authority of his own experience, and asking for help from a widow who spent her mornings writing in a notebook in a dead orchard was not a natural act for him. He was doing it anyway. "Come back Thursday," she said. "Bring whatever records you have." He nodded. He left. She stood at the fence line after his wagon was out of sight and felt something that she had not entirely expected to feel, not about Edgar Briggs specifically. A kind of recognition that the work had become larger than she had known it was going to be when she paid $8 for 43 trees and walked home with the bill of sale. She had not been building a personal solution to a personal problem. She had been building a method, and the method was becoming useful in ways she could not have predicted on that October morning at the kitchen table. She went inside and opened the notebook and wrote, "September." Briggs asked about his walnuts. "Coming Thursday. I should begin thinking about how to structure what I know so other people can use it without needing me present for every conversation." She underlined the last sentence. The first leaves came down in October, 1 year from the day she had walked the orchard for the first time with her notebook. She stood in the second row on a morning with a sharpness in the air that reminded her of the first October, and she looked at the trees around her that were different from the trees they had been, and she thought about what the difference meant. Not the visible difference, though that was real and significant. The canopy structure on the south end. The vigor of the growth on the north end, where the drainage had been corrected. The center trees, the ones she had regrafted and waited for through a May and June that had felt very long, now showing the kind of branch development that told her next spring's growth would be substantial. She could see in the skeleton of them the possibility of fruit. Next year, that was what she had bought for $8. Not a dead orchard, not a speculation. The possibility of fruit recovered from the certainty of nothing. Lorena had come to the edge of the orchard while Mabel was thinking, which was something Lorena did without making any production of it. She stood at the fence line and looked at the trees for a while, and Mabel turned and found her there. 1 year, Lorena said. "Yes, what does the notebook say compared to where you started?" Mabel thought about the October entries she'd made on her first walk-through. The questions without answers, the observations she hadn't known how to interpret yet, the things she'd written down because she didn't know what else to do with them. "It says I didn't know what I was doing when I started," she said. "I just knew there was something to find. And now? Now I know what I found," Mabel said. "And I know how I found it, which is different, which means I can find it again." Lorena looked at the orchard. The leaves were coming down in the clean way of a healthy tree, releasing what it no longer needed, not the struggling drop of a sick tree losing what it couldn't hold on to. "Someone asked me last week," Lorena said, "if you were taking on any more work, aside from Sampson and Briggs." "Who asked?" "A woman from the settlement north of here. Her family's fruit trees have been declining. She heard about what you're doing." "Word travels," Mabel said. "You've given it reason to," Lorena said simply. She looked at the center trees, the two that had taken until June to respond, the ones that had been the longest uncertainty. "Those two are what I'd show people," she said, "if I were explaining what the work means. Not the easy ones. Those." Mabel looked at them. "They took the longest," she said. "I almost." She stopped. "I didn't doubt the approach. But I wondered for a few weeks whether those specific trees were too far gone." "Were they?" "No," she said. "How do you know the difference?" Lorena asked. "Between too far gone and not far enough along." Mabel had thought about this more than she had thought about almost anything else in the past year. You look at them carefully enough that you're not deciding in advance, she said. You write down what you see rather than what you expect to see, and you don't stop before you have actual evidence. Lorena was quiet. Most people decide first, Mabel said. They look after to confirm. What I'm doing is the other direction. Look first. Decide after. That's the whole method, Lorena said. It wasn't a question. That's the whole method, Mabel agreed. They stood in the October orchard while the leaves came down around them, the clean, ordinary release of a year's work, returning to the ground to become next year's nourishment, the way things cycle when they're allowed to cycle right. Pearl would come home from school in an hour, and she would probably, given Pearl's character, immediately ask about the center trees and whether they had looked any different today than yesterday. Mabel would tell her they looked the same as yesterday and different from a year ago. Pearl would consider this seriously and then go climb the fence and look for herself, because that was who she was. And the notebook on the kitchen table held a year of what looking carefully produced. 43 trees that everyone had decided were finished, and the record of why they were wrong, and the specific evidence of what attention and patience, and the refusal to accept an easy verdict had made possible. She had not rescued a dead orchard. She had understood a living one. That was the work. It had always been the work. She had just been the one, in the end, willing to do it.